Alrighty, so just like the templating, string templating that I introduced a little earlier, this is another feature of ES6 that I have used so much. It's in my muscle memory. It's significant in that it reduces the amount of code that you're going to have to write, and it looks really great. And so I just want to introduce that here in this video, as well as some features of Low Dash that'll take advantage of that syntax so that I can use it for the rest of the series. Again, ES6 is the latest version of JavaScript, or, well, rather, ECMA script, and it includes a bunch of awesome features. We'll have a video about the other features later. And you can use these features in Node, later versions of Node, not older versions of Node, but you cannot yet use these features directly in the browser without using a build step, which consequently we will be actually talking about in this series. So yeah, arrow functions. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce them real fast. I'm going to create a JS file called arrow. And let's talk about the different ways that we can create functions in JavaScript. One way that we create functions is, obviously we have named functions. So function, let's say, let's call this function loop over 10, and then let's say action. And the loop over 10 function is just going to say for var equals I, you know what I'm saying. I smaller than 10, I++, and then for each iteration, we're just going to invoke action. So this is one way that we can declare a function in JavaScript. We can also declare a function as an anonymous closure. For example, if we do loop over 10, we can pass in a function to this called, then we call this number, and I can say console log number. So then if I go and I execute this by typing in node arrow, notice how we get 0 through 10 printed, or 0 through 9 printed. So this is another way that you'll commonly see functions written in JavaScript. But with ES6, there's a new way to write functions. And those are called arrow functions. And you'll notice this if you're familiar with C#. These are basically C# lambdas. The syntax is actually entirely the same. So if we say loop over 10, we can now write this. Number goes into console log number. If I come back here, ignore that squiggle. I'll talk about that squiggle in a second. Go to node arrow. Now, let's go ahead and just comment this out so we're not confusing our outputs. And let's do that again. We see the exact same behavior. So before I go ahead and actually break the syntax down for you guys, this error is telling me that the Visual Studio Code is in ES5 mode, or ES3 mode, an older version of ECMA script. What we have to do is we have to write a JS config file that tells VS Code that we want to use the newer features of JavaScript. You won't have to do this for other editors, but for you guys using code, this is how you do it. Hop over here, create a new file, call it jsconfig.json. Now the cool thing about this in Visual Studio Code is you'll get code completion. So what I can do is open up a JavaScript object, open up a some quotes, and hit Control space. The one we want is compiler options. Inside of compiler options, we want target, and for target, we want ES6. By doing that, you might have to close your arrow.json and your jsconfig.json before it takes effect. So let's do that now. And let's open back up arrow.js. Now notice that squiggle is gone. So this was completely valid code. It was just code doesn't like using newer features, unless you tell it to. So let's break this down. We have a function called loop over 10 that accepts another function called action, and it simply invokes that action 10 times. With this code, we passed in an anonymous function that you would be very, very familiar with if you've spent any time doing JavaScript. But in this case, we're using the arrow function. Now, the arrow function, or the n-arrow function, what we have here on the left-hand side is the list of parameters, followed by equals greater than. Now, this stands for goes to, or goes into. So number goes into console log number. And on the right-hand side, we have a body. So what's interesting about this is there's a couple variations of the syntax. Another variation is, let's say that we wanted to do multiple lines of code. We couldn't add multiple lines of code here as it stands. We'll get a compiler error. But we can if we do this. If we introduce a curly brace, we can now write in multiple lines of code. So I can say console log number, and then I can also say console log number times 10. And now if I run node arrow, we see that our second iteration has 2 console log statements. And that's how we're able to write multi-line. So another thing is, what if our action only had no parameters, for example? So no param func. When you do this, you can't just do arrow equal or goes into console log high. You won't be able to do this. Instead, you have to replace the parenthesis list with an empty, the parameter list with an empty parentheses. So now I can go ahead and invoke no param func just as if it was a normal function, which, by the way, it is. As you can see, high is now being printed out. What if we have a multi-parameter function? So multi-param func. In this case, you have to add the parentheses. So I'll do left, right, goes into left plus right. So this is actually interesting because we're introducing 2 new things about arrow functions. First of all, if you have multiple parameters, you have to include the parentheses. Some people, even when they have 1 parameter, include the parentheses, which is completely fine. You can go in here and add the parentheses, but when you have 1 parameter, they're not required. So in this case, we have 2 parameters, so we have to use parentheses, and then goes into. But notice right here, the code that I'm writing. It's not a statement. I'm not doing any action. I'm performing an operation. This is a pure function. So what happens with this? What does it do? What's it good for? The answer is, when you use the single line arrow function syntax, the expression that's on the right-hand side of this operator is the return statement. So I can say console log multi-param func 1020 and come back here, and let's go ahead and add all that to our commented out stuff. And see 30 is being printed out. But 30 isn't being printed out from the function. 30 is being printed out from this console log, which is invoking this function with 2 parameters. So you'll notice that this statement is the exact equivalent of if I had done this. Well, there's actually a couple subtle differences, but that's not relevant to what we're talking about. These 2 lines of code, these 2 functions are pretty much, for all intents and purposes, identical. Now, the one thing you need to be aware of, if you want to do multiple statements, like this will now no longer work. It'll return undefined. When you introduce the curly braces on your arrow functions, you must specifically put in a return statement. Alrighty. There's one more aspect to this that is slightly esoteric. And it's important to understand, and it comes into some aspects of JavaScript that also, if you want to take a look at that code, do it now because I'm deleting it. It comes into play with some concepts of JavaScript that are sometimes difficult for people to understand and might not fully understand even though they take advantage of it, and that is the concept of this. And this plays into arrow functions. So let's go ahead and put together a really straightforward example, something that you probably actually have already run into when working with JavaScript. Let's start off with an object. So I'm going to say var obj, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give it some properties, like name is Nelson. I'm also going to go ahead and give it a function, such as show name is function. I could also use arrow functions here. I could also use this syntax, which is also new in ES6 that I almost forgot about. When defining a object, this is perfectly equivalent to that. These 2 statements are practically identical. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove that and use the newer syntax because that's another bit of syntax that I will be using. So the show name, let's say we want to go ahead and let's say console log my name is this name. And if we do obj show name and then invoke it, notice how it says my name is Nelson. Now let's say that we wanted to throw in a callback. Let's say we were like binding, for example, to a jQuery event, or that we were setting a timeout. That's a good example. I could say set timeout, which, by the way, does exist in Node, but you don't do Windows set timeout. You simply do set timeout. Set timeout, and I'll pass in a function that I want to execute after, let's say, 1 second. And then I'll say console log, my name is still this.name. So I'm sure if you spend a lot of time in JavaScript, I'm sure you know exactly where I'm going with this. My name is Nelson, and then it says my name is still undefined, which there's a problem there. And the problem is that the this inside this closure is not the this that showName got executed under. So the context changed. The object is different. Think of it as the context of execution is different when we're in this closure, and this will happen to any closure that you use. So if you, like I said, if you're binding to a JavaScript event or you were using a low dash function. So how do we fix this? Well, the common way to fix this in modern JavaScript, well, not modern JavaScript, but traditionally in JavaScript, is before we get to that closure, we would alias out our this. So we would say self equals this, or that equals this. That's always what I've used, is that equals this. So we alias out the this variable before we enter the closure. And then when we enter the closure, instead of doing this, we do that. And now if I come in here, my name is Nelson, and now my name is still Nelson. So that's one way to do it. But arrow functions do this implicitly for you. One of the coolest things about arrow functions. So let me show you. If I use an arrow function instead, I just noticed I'm not using template strings. I'm the worst. Notice how we now get our expected behavior. Whoops, I said that.name. That was a terrible example. Let's do this.name and prove it that it actually works. And it does. So we see that by using the arrow function, this is hoisted into the closure. So we don't have to alias it out into an additional variable that we hoist up manually. So that's a very, 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 very important aspect of these arrow functions, and it can come back to bite you in certain circumstances. 99% of the time, what you're seeing highlighted right now is the behavior that you want, is the behavior that you're expecting, and is the behavior that you should use. 1% of the time, sometimes it causes issues. So we'll just, I guess, leave it at that. So yeah, I think we'll actually go ahead and take a look at Low Dash here in the next video. Running a little bit short on time, but I guess I just really wanted this video to really stress the importance of arrow functions and that I will be using them. Please get used to using them when you can. I know you can't use them in the browser right now, but one of the biggest important things about this series is we're going to be talking about how you can use all these ES6 features in the browser by using a transpiler. So it's a great thing to start learning now. Anyway, I guess we'll talk about Low Dash in a moment here. See you guys then.